Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode 285. Albert McGowan. Albert McGowan, in the criminal court, was sentenced to 2 years' imprisonment with hard labour on a charge of bigamy on the 27th of October 1911. Albert George McGowan was actually born Albert George Walkerden on the 31st of March 1872 in Carlton, Victoria, to George Walkerden, a bricklayer, and Ellen Elizabeth O'Leary. Albert's paternal grandfather, Joseph Walkerden, was English, and he immigrated to Australia with his family at the age of 11 in about 1840. He married Annie Hickson, known as Nancy, at St James's Church in Melbourne in 1848, with Joseph's brother Henry and his sister-in-law Jane as witnesses. His brother Joseph was a bricklayer as well. On the 8th of November 1898 in the Melbourne Age, it outlined the death of Joseph Walkerden. The case of Joseph Walkerden, aged 60, who cut his throat with a razor in Carlton on Saturday, was inquired into at the morgue. Nancy Walkerden, the widow of the deceased, described how she found her husband when she returned home on Saturday evening. During the week he'd been very peculiar and behaved as if something was preying on his mind. He did not drink. George Walkerden, son of the deceased, deposed that he saw his father last Thursday night and he was suffering from delusions. And fearing that he might do himself an injury, he advised his mother and brother that a doctor ought to be called in, but his advice was ignored. Thomas Walkerden, another son of the deceased, said he'd not thought on Thursday that his father was so bad as to need to be put under restraint. On Friday, the witness's mother said the deceased was getting worse, but when suggested that he ought to be taken charge of by the police, she burst into tears and said it would be a disgrace to the family. It was remarked that it was a great pity people should have the idea of disgrace with regard to restraint of a person who is requiring looking after. In the present case, an error had been committed in not taking steps to place the deceased under restraint, and a verdict of suicide while temporarily restrained was returned. So George Walkerden was the fourth out of 7 children, and Albert's mother, Ellen, was Irish and 11 years older than George. George was 21 and Ellen 32. On George's death certificate, it stated he was not married, so there clearly was no formal marriage record for George and Ellen. However, Ellen did state in a newspaper article that they'd married in 1871. Ellen had been married to John Hayes, and he died in 1866. She had children to John Hayes, and it seems that she also had 3 children to unknown fathers between 1869 and her marriage to George. On Monday, the 7th of October, 1889, there was a maintenance order for 8 shillings a week that was made against an elderly man, a plasterer named George Walkerden today, for the maintenance of 3 of his children by Alan Hayes, with whom he'd lived for 18 years but recently deserted. Alan died in 1895. The informant was an employee of the benevolent home where George died. Albert was committed into state care on the 25th of August 1883 at the age of 11 years. He was committed for 1 year due to neglect. The remarks were that he'd been running away from home and refusing to go to school, however was not dishonest. He was committed to the Sandhurst Boys' Home on the 30th of August 1883, but was returned to his mother at Carlton on the 21st of December 1883. However, on the 26th of November 1884 in the Melbourne Age, it says, left home, Albert George Walkerden. Persons harbouring him will be prosecuted. Information thankfully received. George Walkerden of Princess Street, Carlton. Albert George Walkerden married Annie Hooker in 1891 in Ballarat. He was 19 and Annie was 29. Annie had been born in Carisbrooke, Victoria, and had previously been married to Philip Morgan in Fitzroy in April 1884 when she was 21, and they had a daughter, Gertrude Harriet Annie, in 1885, and it seems another 2 children were born to that union as well. Annie divorced Philip on the grounds of adultery in January 1891, and then Albert and her married in the December of that year. Annie and Albert had a son together, William Albert, in 1894, and Winifred Eva in 1897. On the 5th of August 1898, Annie was sent to the Balola jail in New South Wales as she had no visible means of support. by the 27th of December 1902, she's back in Melbourne living in Errol Street, North Melbourne. In 1903, they're both listed as living together at Queensbury Place, North Melbourne. It seems that Albert commenced a relationship with Grace Beatrice Haynes, and they lived in South Australia around 1903 and 1904. They had a daughter, Alice Haynes, who later used the surname Walkerden as an adult, and Grace had her at the Melbourne's Women Hospital on the 6th of August 1904. The birth certificate doesn't mention a father, and it says that Grace Haynes is 18 years old and living in Carlton at the time. On the 27th of September 1904 in the Melbourne Argus, at the Warden's Court in Heidelberg, J.C. Craig and Albert George Walkerden, the holders of miners' rights, applied to have compensation fixed for an alluvial claim pegged out at Arthur's Creek, which was enclosed as an orchard, the property of Mr. James Burke. The applicant stated that without any written authority from Mr. Burke, they'd climbed over his fence and pegged out a claim on the creek frontage. The authority was obtained from the mining registrar, and they'd not included any of the cultivated ground in their claim. The orchardist questioned the men's title to the claim, saying it was within an enclosed orchard, which they'd entered without written consent from the owner. The miners contended that it was too late to take any such objection, and that the bylaws had been complied with. James Burke, in giving evidence, said that he reserved the piece of land which had been pegged out to work his orchard. It was required to turn the horses when ploughing. If it was severed, he would have to remove a row of 6-year-old trees to obtain the necessary room. The claim would also deprive him of a portion of his water right to the creek and would retard his outlet to the road. The trees were just coming into bearing. He had 5 acres in all, and he valued it at £1,000. The miners said that the land was worth £7 or £8 an acre. They required less than 1/6 of an acre and would do very little damage, as they proposed to sink a shaft. The warden agreed that the only question before him at present was fixing compensation, and he allowed £30 without costs. On the 9th of December 1904, James C. Craig appeared in the City Court to answer a charge of larceny of £7, 13 shillings and 4 pence, the money of a co-partnership. Craig was a partner with Albert George Walkerden and William Beecham in a claim at Arthur's Creek. The fourth partner, named Kimpton, recently joined the enterprise and paid £10 for the privilege. It was alleged that Craig only gave his partners £2, 6 shillings and 6 pence of that amount and kept the remaining £7, 13 shillings and 4 pence. The accused defended himself and stated the money was spent on food and tools for the benefit of the party. Mr. Panton PM accepted Craig's story and dismissed the case. On the 30th of May 1905, Albert George Walkerden was in the Government Gazette, charged on warrant, issued at the instance of his wife, Annie Walkerden, of Cromwell Street, Collingwood, with deserting his 3 children at Collingwood. Just a note, they've definitely had 2 registered children together. What I'm suspecting is that maybe the youngest of Annie's children from her previous marriage could have been included in this number. He was described as a labourer, 41, 5 foot 6 inches high, with dark curly hair, a dark moustache and a slight build. He wore a brown coat, blue trousers and vest, and a black alpine hat. Why he was missing? Well, he married Isabella Susan Smithers on the 20th of May 1905 under the name Albert George McGowen. Isabella had been born in 1874 in Warrnambool. Isabella stated that he left her 3 weeks after their marriage, which would have been mid-June 1904. Grace Beatrice Haynes had a son, Francis Stanley Haynes, on the 6th of August 1904 in Sydney. Again, the father was not listed. However, Francis Stanley Haynes used the surname Walkerden as an adult. So was Albert even aware of this child? On the 15th of July 1905 in the Melbourne Argus, alleged bigamy. At 7 o'clock on Friday morning, Constable Dillon arrested a man named Albert George Walkerden, 39, a bricklayer, on charge of having deserted his 2 children. A few minutes before Walkerden was to appear in the Fitzroy Court, the same morning Mrs. Annie Walkerden, his wife, signed a warrant charging her husband with bigamy. On these charges, Walkerden appeared, and on application of the police, Walkerden was remanded to appear before the Collingwood Court. Mrs. Walkerden states she was married to Walkerden at Ballarat in 1891. Later on, they removed to Melbourne. She and her husband lived together until the 29th of May, when he left her and the children, whose ages ranged from 7 to 13 years. She stated that on Thursday she ascertained that on the evening of the 20th of May, Walkerden went through a form of marriage with a young woman named Isabella Susan Smithers at a matrimonial office in the city. On the 20th of May, he told his wife that he was going to work at Maldon. The story about going to Maldon was simply to deceive his wife, as the same day he married Isabella at Holt's matrimonial agency. On the 13th of July, Mrs. Walkerden became aware of the bigamous marriage. She ascertained that the accused and the young woman were living together under the name of Mr. and Mrs. McGowan at a lodging house in Fitzroy. As the offence was committed in the city, it would be necessary to remand Walkerden to appear at the city court. He was then charged with having deserted his 2 children, aged 7 and 11 years. Anne Walkerden deposed that the defendant is my husband. We've been married for 14 years and there are 2 children. On the 20th of May, my husband told me he was going to Maldon to work at a mine there, and then he left me. Last week I discovered he'd gone through a marriage with a woman at a matrimonial office. During the time he's been away from me, he has sent me 3 sums of money amounting to £2 and 9 shillings. The defendant asked, "Didn't I send you £5? The witness said, "No, only £2 9 shillings. I tried to withdraw the warrant for deserting your children but couldn't." Constable Dillon said, "I arrested the accused at a house in North Fitzroy on July 14th. Until the accused was confronted by his wife, he denied that his name was Walkerden." The defendant said, "The evidence shows that I didn't desert the children. There is a great deal behind this case, as that woman, pointing to his wife, will find out later on." No doubt he's thinking in the back of his mind that he's had a mistress, Grace Beatrice Haynes, and 2 other children that have been born that his wife has no idea about, it seems, at this time. On the 20th of July 1905, there's an article where Albert is quoted, "I'll go back to jail. I prefer to be an outlaw." Such was the remark today of a bright specimen of a father named Albert G. Walkerden, who was charged at the Collingwood court with deserting his 2 children. It appeared that the accused left his wife on the pretence of going up to the country looking for work, but was subsequently found living in Brunswick with another woman, over whom he is to stand for a trial of bigamy. His wife said that she was willing to support herself if he would support the 2 children. The bench made an order for 5 shillings per week for each child and fixed bail on the bigamy charge of 2 sureties of £50 each. It was then that Walkerden said he would go back to jail. And another article says Albert G. Walkerden, against whom the serious charge of bigamy was levelled at the City Court today, is a youngish-looking man whose appearance would entitle him to be included in the category of respectable. The story was told by the witnesses that on the 9th of December 1891 the defendant was united in matrimonial bonds to his wife Annie. Ample proof was given of this marriage, which took place at Ballarat, for in addition to the certificate and the oath of the wife, testimony was given by Mr. S. Walker, the registrar of Ballarat, and James Beckett, a legal manager of Ballarat, who witnessed the marriage. Neither Mr. Walker nor Mr. Beckett were able, after the lapse of time, to identify the defendant, but both were able to testify to their signature on the documents. Mrs. Walkerden said she lived with her husband in May last, when he went away saying he was going to Western Australia. On the 14th of the present month, she found him at Brunswick Street, Fitzroy, under circumstances which led her to take the present proceedings. Isabella Susan Smithers, domestic servant, said she was married to the defendant by Pastor Abbott at a matrimonial agency in Melbourne on the 20th of May. He was married under the name of Albert George McGowen. Constable Nolan stated that when he arrested the accused, he said his wife's decree nisi in divorce was not made absolute. He doubted the legality of the marriage. The defendant was committed for trial. On the 24th of August 1905 in the Melbourne Argus, Husband's Dilemma, which marriage is legal. At the criminal court yesterday, before Mr. Justice Holroyd, in the matter of Albert George Walkerden, who's been committed for trial on a charge of bigamy, a presentment was not filed and he was discharged. Walkerden complained that while under arrest on the charge of bigamy, the same informant secured an order by Collingwood magistrates who ordered the payment of 10 shillings a week for the maintenance of the informant's children. He stated, "The court ordered me to find a surety besides my own for the payment of the maintenance. Now I've had no chance at all to get another surety because I've been kept in jail, and I'd like the sureties to be made one my own so that I can get a release and fight the matter out." Mr. Justice Holroyd informed Walkerden that protest against a magistrate's order could be made by way of appeal to the Court of General Sessions or by an application that the order be varied. Walkerden could communicate with the Crown Solicitor on the matter. When being escorted out of the court, Walkerden asked, "Your Honour, which marriage is legal, the first or the second? I don't want to be brought up on another charge of bigamy." Mr. Justice Holroyd said, "I cannot answer such a question. I haven't heard any evidence."
In his Victorian jail record, he stated he was 6 years older than he was, although this was corrected in the record. On the 2nd of March 1906, he was discharged to freedom by order of His Excellency upon the prisoner entering into his own recognisance in the sum of £25 to contribute to the support of his children. As a result of the bigamy charge, his marriage to Annie was declared null and void. Annie went on to marry William Thomas Gardner in 1910 in Victoria. William Thomas Gardner died on the 1st of September 1941 at his residence in Preston, Victoria. It says he was the beloved husband of Anne Gardner and grandfather of Gertrude Dorothy, Mrs. Porteous, Henry and Edward, New Zealand, after a long illness, and it was inserted by his granddaughter, Gertrude Ramsdale. Annie lived until she was 93. On the 17th of March 1909, under the name of Albert George McGowen, he married Charlotte Annie Brown. Charlotte Annie Brown was born in Hamilton in 1882. Charlotte had a daughter, Dorothy Irene Brown, in Hamilton in 1902 when she was 20. The father was not listed. However, on Dorothy's death certificate, it does state that her father was Walter Powell. They're listed as living in Hamilton in 1909, with Albert George McGowen being a bricklayer. They had a son, Albert Norman McGowan, on the 3rd of March 1910 in Hamilton, Victoria. On the 28th of September 1911 in the Victoria Police Gazette, Albert George McGowan is charged on warrant issued at the instance of his wife, Isabella Susan McGowan of Carlton, that he did feloniously and unlawfully marry Charlotte Annie Brown at Collingwood on the 17th of March 1909. His description: Victorian, bricklayer's labourer, 39 years of age, 5 foot 4 or 5 inches high, thin build, sallow complexion, clean-shaven, dark curly hair with a long thin face, wore dark clothes. On the 6th of October 1911 in the Adelaide Advertiser, it announced that in Melbourne on the 5th of October a charge of bigamy. At the Collingwood Court today, Albert George McGowan, a young man, was presented on a charge of bigamy. Isabella Susan McGowan said she was the wife of the accused. On the 25th of May 1905, she was married to him at the Holt's Registry Office. After the marriage, she and her husband resided at Richmond in the house of Mrs. Wharton, who was a witness of the marriage. The accused left her after 3 weeks to go to Warrigal, and she subsequently found that he was living with another woman in Collingwood. She had lived with the accused for 18 months altogether. Mostly she had to support herself after the marriage. The accused said to her, "Are you aware of the fact that I was arrested on a warrant for bigamy through marrying you and the case broke down?" The witness said, "No, it was through you marrying another woman." Charlotte Annie McGowan, née Brown, said she was married to the accused by Reverend Andrew Ferguson of Victoria Parade, Collingwood, on the 17th of March 1909. The witness knew that he had been a married man, but was not aware that the previous marriage was legal. Detective Napthine said he arrested the accused on the 30th of September. The accused was living with Charlotte Annie McGowan. The accused reserved his defence and was committed for trial. He was jailed on the 31st of September 1911 and then moved to Pentridge on the 2nd of November 1911, and he received 2 years hard labour for this bigamy charge. A son, Bernard, was born while Albert was in jail in Carlton in April 1912, and a daughter, Phyllis, was born in 1914. On the 28th of May 1912, he petitioned for a release, but it was refused by His Excellency. He was freed on the 3rd of May 1913. In the 1914 census, he's listed under Albert George McGowan, living at Brunswick West, as a harbour trust worker, with Charlotte Annie McGowan living with him. In 1915, in the census, Charlotte Annie McGowan is living in North Melbourne, however, Albert's not listed. In 1919, they're living in Collingwood. He's still a harbour trust worker, and again, he's living with Charlotte Annie. Interestingly, in 1919, I found a marriage certificate for Albert George McGowan to a Mary Ann Elizabeth Owen. By 1920s in Tasmania. On the 4th of December 1920, in the Launceston Examiner, Detective Sergeant Summers conducted the prosecution in the City Police Court yesterday of Albert George McGowan, who was remanded for 8 days on a charge of deserting 3 illegitimate children at Wonthaggi, Victoria, on the 29th of November 1919. The detective stated that an escort was expected from Melbourne in the course of a few days, and it was for that reason that he requested the remand. On the 25th of November 1920 in the Launceston Examiner, Albert McGowan proceeded against his wife, Violet McGowan, in the City Court yesterday morning for having stolen from his house in Margaret Street furniture valued at £9.10. The defendant denied the charge. Albert McGowan stated that on the 13th of November he went home from work and found several articles of bedding and furniture had been removed from his house. All he could find in the house was a text on "Be ye faithful until death." The articles were sold to a dealer in Wellington Street. The police magistrate intimated that there was no proof as to who sold the goods and he could not convict. This wife was Violet May Morton. She'd been born in 1886 in Richmond, Tasmania, so was 14 years younger than Albert, and in 1922 in the census she was living at North Launceston. And on the 4th of February 1921 in the Melbourne Argus, Albert George McGowan of Tasmania was charged before Justice Newell and a jury with having left the state while an order for the Wonthaggi bench to pay £1.16 a week towards the support of his 3 illegitimate children remained unsatisfied. It was stated for the Crown that under the order only £1 had been paid. Proceedings were instituted against the surety and £20 was recovered. The amount now due under the order is £61.10. On the 24th of March 1920, the children were boarded out to the mother. The accused was arrested at Launceston. For the defence, it was said that McGowan had gone to Tasmania to earn money to provide for the children. McGowan was found guilty and remanded for sentence. The 3 illegitimate children referred to are Charlotte Annie Brown's children that she had with Albert. So that is Albert Norman McGowan, Bernard Hamilton McGowan, and Phyllis Annie McGowan. He then married Rhoda Heather in 1923 in Victoria. He married Rhoda under the surname of McGowan. Rhoda was 27 when they married and Albert was 51. In 1924 they lived in North Carlton and in 1925 in Brunswick South with Albert working as a bricklayer, and by 1927 they had separated and Rhoda is listed in the 1935 census under her maiden name in Balaclava, Victoria. Albert George Walkerden, or Albert George McGowan, died on the 1st of July 1930 at the Austin Hospital in Heidelberg. He was 56. He died of throat cancer, and all that was stated in relation to his marriages or children was that he was married 3 times, but all other details were unknown. It seems that there was a representative from the Austin Hospital who was the informant, so the only information that they would have gleaned was from Albert himself. Now to what became of his children and his wives. Well, starting with Annie Hooker. Annie married William Gardner, and it's stated that Annie was known as Annie Walker, and this accounts for the use of Walker as the surnames of the children that she had with Albert. The firstborn, William Albert, who was born in 1894 in Ballarat East, went by the surname of Walker from an adult, and this was the surname he used when he married Marin Sylvia Rogan in Maryborough, Victoria in 1912, when he was 18 and Marin 21. They had 3 sons together, and they lived in Maryborough until 1920, when they went to live in Carlton, where he worked as a storeman. And William died on the 26th of December 1979 in Western Australia at the age of 85. Marin had died a year earlier in Brunswick, Victoria. His second child that he had with Annie Hooker was Winifred Eva Walkerden on the 19th of June 1897 in Bendigo. Under the name of Winifred Eva Walker, she married Sydney Harden in Victoria in 1915, and they had 5 children together. Winifred died on the 24th of September 1988 at Brassall, Queensland at the age of 91. Now to his children with Grace Beatrice Haynes. A little on Grace. Well, in the South Australian Police Gazette says that information is requested of Grace Beatrice Haynes, a native of Victoria who left her home at Northcote, Victoria on the 21st of March 1904 and came to Adelaide and lived with a man named Walkerden as his wife in furnished apartments at Kensington, which she left on the 27th. Nothing has since been heard of her. Description is 18.5 years old, 5 foot 3 inches tall, with a fair complexion, fair hair, dark blue eyes, a boot finisher. In 1914, Grace is listed in the census as living with her parents and siblings in Northcote, Victoria, and working as a white worker, and she's listed under the name of Gracie Haynes. So at this time, their daughter Alice would have been 10, and their son Francis would have been 9. In 1925, Grace Haynes, under the name of Mrs. Grace Walkerden, was a grocer in Carlton, Victoria. She then married Harold John Robinson in 1931 at Clifton Hill in Victoria, and she died on the 21st of May 1961 at the Royal Melbourne Hospital, aged 76. The two children that Grace Haynes had with Albert: Alice, who was born Alice Haynes but later took on the name of Walkerden. She was born at the Melbourne Women's Hospital on the 6th of August 1904. She married Charles Finnegan in 1923 in Victoria, and they had 6 daughters: Betty, Roma, Anita, Dawn, Ruth and Anne. Alice died on the 19th of January 1979 in Prahran, Victoria, aged 74. On her death certificate, her parents were listed as unknown Walkerden and Grace Beatrice Haynes. Grace is buried with Alice and Alice's husband, Charles. The son that Albert and Grace Haynes had together was Francis Stanley Haynes, who also used Walkerden as an adult. He was known as Frank and was born on the 16th of July 1905 in Sydney. He was a fitter and an engineer and lived in Preston, Victoria in 1931. He married Gladys Widifred Wortley in Victoria in 1941 when he was 36 and Gladys 30. He served in World War II and he died on the 17th of November 1979 at Mount Waverley, Victoria, aged 74. His death certificate stated that his father's name was unknown. Frank and Gladys had no children. The children that he had with Charlotte Annie Brown, well, a little bit firstly on Charlotte. She married John Francis Shipton in 1920 when she was 38 and John 28. In 1930, they were living in Bendigo, and she died in 1977 in Echuca, Victoria, at the age of 94. So the first child that Charlotte and Albert had together was Albert Norman McGowan, who was born on the 3rd of March 1910 in Hamilton. Albert was committed into state care on the 6th of December 1911 in North Melbourne, the reason stating no means. The notes that are in his state care record, the first thing is that it asks, is he illegitimate, as it was a result of a bigamous marriage. The information on the father says Albert George McGowen is at present at Pentridge undergoing a sentence of 2 years imposed on him on the 26th of October 1911 for bigamy. His circumstances are poor. The mother, Charlotte Ann Brown, is living at North Carlton. She's been assisted by the Benevolence Society and by her brother. She is expected to give birth to another child next month and is at present in bad health. So Albert was placed in Carlton on the 6th of December 1911, then on the 1st of August 1912 in Hamilton, then on the 1st of January 1913 in North Melbourne, and then it states on the 19th of August 1913 he was discharged. However, on his record it does say his expiration was not until the 3rd of March 1928. Him and his brother Bernard are listed in the Government Gazette in Victoria on the 19th of August 1926, when Albert was 16 and Bernard 14. And it says that on the 12th of May, in Wilson, South Australia, Bernard McGowan, Albert Norman McGowan and John Johnson for larceny on Stephen Bombardieri has been proceeded against on summons by Constable Hogben and Constable Rawilla in Bendigo. Albert joined the militia forces in Bendigo in 1930. In 1934 he married Lillian Phyllis Breyer, and he died on the 15th of April 1993 in Bendigo, aged 83. His younger brother Bernard Hamilton McGowan was born in Carlton on the 5th of April 1912. He was committed into state care on the 15th of May 1912 in North Melbourne, and the cause of commitment was no means. In his record, it states that he is illegitimate as a result of a bigamous marriage. The notes on the parents say Albert George McGowan is at present in Pentridge serving a 2-year sentence for bigamy. On the 17th of March 1909, he went through a form of marriage with the child's mother. The marriage afterwards was found to be a bigamous one. Charlotte Annie Brown is listed at living at Barclay Street in Carlton, living in poor circumstances. And then it mentions how his brother is also in care. On the 15th of May 1912, he was sent to Carlton. Then on the 1st of August 1912, he went to Hamilton. On the 1st of January 1913 in North Melbourne, and he was discharged on the 19th of August 1913. So it seems that the brothers were together in Hamilton, North Melbourne, and discharged at the same time. However, his expiration of term was listed as the 5th of April 1930. In 1934, he was living in Bendigo, and in 1935, he married Thelma Maud Butler. They had a son, Kevin John McGowan, in 1936. He enlisted in the Royal Australian Air Force on the 28th of March 1942 in North Bendigo and was discharged as a corporal on the 21st of February 1946. He married Gloria Elizabeth Dickens in 1948 in Victoria when Gloria was 25 and Bernard 36. They are listed as living in Bendigo in 1949, where Bernard's working as a drover. In 1980, they're living in the ACT at Latham, where Bernard's listed as working as a labourer. Bernard died on the 16th of January 1993 in Eagle Hawk, Victoria at the age of 80, and on his plaque it says, in loving memory of Bernard H. McGowan, loved father of Judith, Kevin, Lynn, Raymond and Bruce. The third child that Charlotte Brown had with Albert was Phyllis Annie McGowan, who was born on the 26th of March 1913 in Bendigo. She married William James Reed, a carpenter in Bendigo in 1946, and they had 2 sons. And she died at Nya, Victoria, near Swan Hill, on the 10th of May 2000 at the age of 87. So I hope you enjoyed the story of Albert George Walkerden, also known as Albert George Walkerden, and Albert George McGowan. He was certainly a very complicated man to research.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.